an effort to get through chapter 12 today, we're going to go ahead and get started. So what I'm thinking is, if we can get through 12 today, I won't be here next week, so if David can get at least 13 started, or if we have just a little bit of 12 left, finish that, then probably we're looking at wrapping things up, I would say probably the 5th, and then we can either do a review that following Wednesday, the 8th, or if you guys feel like you want to do a more comprehensive review, we could do that the 12th, and then have the final exam on the 19th. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So don't be worried about the final exam. It won't be open book, actually. No, it'll be closed book. It's like everything off the desk except for the final and a pen or a pencil. So this,
none with a ruler in here.
yeah. So I figured sparing you the quizzes, not turning in the quizzes, that's between you and God. This will be the only thing that I want you to turn in. So keep that in mind. So, but we will definitely do a comprehensive review. So let's get started here with chapter 12, and we'll start in verse 4 because we had concluded the first 3 verses with 11 because it finishes that major thought process there. So starting in verse 4 through 14, it says, "In your struggle against sin you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children, and you are not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord." So, some evidences of God's love from this chapter. And by the way, probably won't spend as deep of time with some of these thoughts because David, in the past 6 months, I would say, had talked about discipline, and then in the next section had talked about the root of bitterness. And so he really went into good detail and length there, kind of picking apart some of these verses. So I recommend you going back and watching those if you want a little bit more insight. But those were well done, and I don't feel the need to really hammer those into ad nauseum again. So some evidences of God's love from this chapter. God has left us his word, inspirational stories, the people's loss and awes, the heroes and heroines of the Old Testament. All of those evidences God has left for our benefit. He has given us Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, literally, to walk among us, to live as we live, to experience what we have to experience, and so that is one of the greatest forms of love that God has shown. For the Hebrew Christians, he had spared them martyrdom, which really indicates that they're probably second generation Hebrew Christians. The first generation was not spared that hostility. He had invested himself in their training and discipline. and it's evident that he does the same for us today. And he invited them into his divine presence, that is heaven. So, discipline of the Lord is proof of his love and the Christian sonship. In Greek, the word chastising means to train a child, instruction, or discipline. And so this is a key theme of chapter 12. The word son, children, or sons occurs 6 times in this short passage here. And the quote is from Proverbs and from Job. And so the preacher makes the following points concerning the discipline of the Lord. The Lord's discipline is proof that he is indeed our Father and we are his children. The Lord's discipline should be viewed positively. The Lord's discipline should not be despised. The Lord's discipline disciplines children because he loves them. To be without the Lord's discipline is to be illegitimate spiritually. And so the preacher is going to encourage the readers to endure their hardships because it is for their betterment and it will produce some fruits, as we'll talk about later in the next couple verses. So discipline is for the following. It is preventative, it's corrective, and it's supportive. And so this is something that if you are a father or a mother, you can relate to quite well. Those of us who haven't experienced that in life probably don't understand it from that perspective as well, but we understand it as children growing up in a household. Our earthly parents tried to do the best they could with disciplining us, and those of us who were raised up in Christian homes especially understand the love and attention and care that went into trying to foster us in a nurturing environment that loves God. Not always pleasant, but sometimes it is necessary. And so how does God discipline his people? Well, he allows our consciences to be pricked. And he also allows us to suffer the consequences from our decisions. And so, can you think of anyone who suffered some pretty severe consequences from their sin that God allowed them to go through from the Old Testament? Moses. What was Moses's discipline?
He did not get to go into the promised land.
Right.
Which
Right.
he had worked his whole
Life towards.
to get into.
Seems kind of cruel, doesn't it?
It did.
Yeah. Seems kind of unfair.
But he saw it.
But he saw it.
David. What?
What did David have to?
You better talk to that boy. Adultery
Adultery. So what was?
and murder.
Okay. So what was his punishment?
His family was.
A mess. Was a mess. Very good. So yeah, those are some great examples. So this is an interesting thought. Discipline prepares Christians for heaven. How so?
Well, I think one thing is, when you're disciplined, a lot of times something is taken from you.
Mm-hmm.
You say, in today's world, first thing they do is taking your phone away from you, your kids, teenagers. But if you are disciplined to the point that you might lose heaven,
Mm-hmm.
something is taken from you. So that's how I kind of correlate the two. You're disciplined, but you still, there's still a chance, as you said.
Right.
So, that's
It says that discipline is going to produce something in this chapter. What does it say it's going to produce? Heaven? what about here on earth? There's some fruits that we will see here too.
Peaceful fruit of righteousness.
Okay. So discipline produces righteousness. What is righteousness?
Doing what is right
Okay.
in God's eyes.
Okay. So through discipline producing right living, we're being prepared for an eternity with Him. And so discipline is necessary for Christians to be prepared to enter eternity with God. We must work to pursue peace. And without holiness, from this verse there, no one can enter into heaven with God. So what does holiness mean?
Well, the only one that can make us holy is Christ.
Right.
And it's through His blood that we are made holy. And holy is, it goes along with being sanctified or set apart.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can't do it by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to have Christ. We have to put on Christ and wear Christ
Mm-hmm.
for that holiness to take root.
Yeah.
Without it, there's no holiness.
Yeah.
What is it? In Sugar Creek, they have that, or they used to have that bulletin board going into Sugar Creek from Walnut Creek. Yeah, no.
Having peace, isn't it?
Yeah, no God, no peace. No God, no peace.
Mm-hmm.
And the KNOW is very, very important.
Right. So, parents, whenever you went to discipline your children, did they always respond in a way that was positive, what you were hoping for?
Oh yeah, Jason said, "Hit me again, harder, harder."
I would say that's probably not the response you're looking for.
Oh, it feels so good.
Wow.
No, that wasn't it.
Yeah,
Here we go.
Grayson, he tries to hit you back and say you're being bad.
Not the response we're looking for. Yeah. So it's true with our discipline as Christians. We can end up despising it.
Mhm.
We can faint under it.
Mhm.
We can become bitter, or we can become better. And so, obviously, we want to strive to become better for it. But same with kids, the same thing can happen. And so, the good thing about being disciplined by the Lord is He knows exactly what we need. It's still our choice as to how we respond. But as parents, there's a lot of scripture about parenting and not disciplining your kids in a way that is out of anger in the heat of the moment and these type of things, because that won't produce the fruit you're looking for. And so what do you see with faithful children, with children who respond positively to discipline? What does that produce here on earth?
Tranquility.
Tranquility. That's a nice word.
I was thinking peace.
Yeah, I was
Peace.
too, but we kind of use it a lot.
Yeah.
But being, makes it a lot tranquil atmosphere.
Yeah. There's something else that begins with an O that children will do.
Order, obey.
Obedience. Yes.
Obstinate.
So,
Yeah. So, you know,
They make a productive adulthood too,
yeah.
if they're,
Yeah.
they do.
Mm-hmm. Proverbs has a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
Train up the way a child should go, and when he grows old, he will not depart from it. So a lot of benefits you can see just from earthly discipline with parents and children. And with any relationship, there's two sides to the relationship. Kids can obviously choose their own way no matter the discipline that's bestowed, the great parenting that may happen, kids ultimately can choose to go wherever they want to go and choose what they want to do. And it's the same thing with us, and I think that's why the Hebrew writer here is reminding us that you've got things to go through. There's going to be things that are going to happen. It's for your betterment, though, because you're going to be more Christ-like at the end of it. That will wrap up our thoughts on discipline. Let's go ahead and continue into the next section. That will finish us up with chapter 12. So, starting in verse 15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels and festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enthralled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, the things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful, receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So, it is possible for some to come short of the grace of God. Someone once said, God's grace does not fail, but we can fail to take advantage of it. And so, again, it is our choice. There are a few sins mentioned here that may have caused some of the Hebrew Christians to come short of the grace of God. One was bitterness. We aren't sure why, but it could have been due to persecution, or it could have been due to discipline, poor judgment, which probably was returning to Judaism, and holding Christ's sacrifice as less than significant. And I think it's interesting that Esau is used here and described as a fornicator, and even connected to sexual immorality. So who can tell me the story of Esau?
He was a hunter. He flippantly sold his birthright because he was hungry.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't important to him. So for a bowl of porridge, he sold his birthright.
Was this birthright just like a couple $100?
No.
No. But this birthright was significant.
Yes,
There were spiritual implications to this birthright.
that's correct.
And so it was true fornication of completely turning away from things that are spiritual and godly and focusing on the physical. Because he was hungry, he gave up everything. And so I think that this is not something I would have thought to have used if I was presenting a similar sermon for these people, but it fits very well. Esau is an example of a person who fails to appreciate and to appropriate the blessings of God's grace.
Question.
Yes.
When we're tempted of our own desires. And based on the type of temptation it is, you ever weigh the disadvantages of giving in to that temptation? The cost of that temptation. So Esau was tempted in a way because physically he was famished. He wanted something to eat and he wanted it now. And some of us have been in that situation where you're just so hungry and you can't get the food in front of you fast enough or in you quick enough. But Esau, you know, it was just for the moment, just that moment, and he blew it. Sometimes sin is like that in the fact that the consequences of it. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Well, the advantage of sin is pleasure. The disadvantage is the consequences. And so, he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. Are we willing to sell our souls for the pleasures of sin?
Right.
Same thing as what we talked about earlier about Moses.
Yeah.
No, he didn't.
No, he didn't. Yeah, so Esau is a really painful reminder and a sobering warning to the Hebrew Christians not to live for lesser things. So the things of the old law specifically for them. And so Esau is an example of how some choices that we make cannot be altered. Sadly, Esau could weep with tears because of his mistake, but he couldn't change his father's decision. And so the sins that we make, the choices that we make sometimes have consequences here on earth that can't be undone. Although God's grace is sufficient to forgive us of those things, many times there are lingering repercussions from our sin and other people's sins that maybe aren't tied to us but affect us through a kind of a ripple effect. So, you look like you want to say something, David.
No.
Okay.
You know, you just brought up a good point. The ripple effect of sin, there always is.
Yeah.
Somebody else besides yourself is going to be affected by that sin.
Right. Yeah. And so, focusing on God's grace here, what are some blessings of God's grace? Number one, God's grace shows the superiority of Christ, first and foremost. In this passage, it's going to contrast the Mount of Sinai and the Mount of Zion. So what happened on Sinai? The law was given, and so whenever it's talking about, for you have come to what may not be touched, and talking about even Moses being being afraid in this passage, it's talking about the giving of the law. And so the giving of the law physically here on earth was a terrifying event. The people actually cried that God would not give them any more instructions, and even Moses was afraid. And so again, we're using that literary term Homer to show the lesser, which is the giving of the old law, to the greater, the giving of the law of Christ. And so the argument here is, if a person is condemned under the old law for not adhering to it, not having rejected it, how much more severe punishment will there be for rejecting Christ, who is obviously greater than the old law? And so, one thing about Mount Sinai that was evident is the Israelites could not freely approach God. What was to happen if they set foot on the mountain?
Stone.
Yeah, and not just them. If any animal touched the mountain, anything, it was to be put to death. And so, what about Mount Zion? What is that analogous to?
Well, that's Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus' sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. And what are we?
Living sacrifice.
Yeah, yeah. So we are we not the are we not mentioned there in the verses as part of the number who are going to be gathered to Zion?
Oh.
It says the church of the firstborn. Are we the church? Yeah. And so who else is going to be? Who else are the inhabitants of the New Jerusalem besides us, the church?
Would be those of old from Hebrews 11.
Right. And so that's the spirits of the righteous people who have been made perfect in Christ. That would include all those heroes and heroines of the Old Testament and 11, all of those under the old law who have been made perfect through Christ's sacrifice. Who else is going to be there? Do what?
The church.
Yeah, the church. You pointed up.
Yeah.
God.
God's going to be there.
God's going to be there.
The
Yeah.
angels.
The angels, the spiritual beings. Very good. Who else besides God the Father, the Spirit? Who else? Uh-huh.
Jesus.
Jesus. Okay. Interestingly enough, I had never really thought about it this way, but I believe that it's kind of evident that Jesus, we were going to be made like him. And whenever Jesus appeared back on earth after he raised from the dead, what did he appear as? A man.
Yeah, he was a man.
I don't think Jesus is going to stop being a man, even in heaven. I think that his putting on of being a man, that won't stop in eternity. It says he was different on the Mount of Transfiguration, but I believe that part of him is going to extend through eternity, and so I think that's an interesting thought. I heard Dan Kessinger talk about that one time during a lecture that I heard, and I had never really thought about it that much. I just kind of assumed he went back to being the spiritual form of God, but I think there's sufficient evidence to suggest that he's retaining that manhood onward. So just an interesting thought there, but
Well, we're gonna have a forum too. So
right, and we're going to be like
We
him.
need,
Mhm.
we need someone to be with us so that we connect. I don't know.
Yeah.
How would we connect
Well,
with the spirit?
he might not be like a physical man.
Right.
Because our bodies will be changed.
Right.
And we will recognize him.
Right.
Whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. I do think that he will have definitely a distinguishing quality about him that we can relate to, and I believe that's because he put on flesh and blood and became a man. So, yeah, definitely some deep stuff to think about. It's interesting. So we have the final warning of apostatizing from God in the next section. So what had started as drifting has now ultimately progressed to completely defying the word and abandoning the grace of God altogether. And so, the use of Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, as we talked about, is a warning to those who will defy his word. The preacher alludes to the prophet Haggai at this point in the sermon. The preacher believed that this prophetic image depicted the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. The argument once more is from lesser to the greater blessings and punishments accompanying the new and better covenant. If the giving of the law of Moses was terrifying, how much more terrifying would the second coming be before those who are not ready? And so we are part of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so there's a song we used to sing,
I shall not be
I
moved.
shall not be moved.
It's in the songbook.
Yeah,
We just don't sing it as an invitation song.
yeah. So that's that the church is going to be forever, through eternity. Those that are saved through Christ's blood are going to spend eternity with him, even after all of these material things are wiped away. The church will remain. So what are some elements necessary for worshiping God acceptably? Well, we have to have grace or gratitude for the kingdom that was given to us. We have to show service, and we have to show reverence or godly fear or awe towards God. Our God is a consuming fire. As someone once observed, God could not really love us unless he hated everything that could destroy us. And so this is ultimately a warning about the coming punishment for those who don't recognize God or want to follow him. And so that is what ultimately is going to happen to the apostate who begin drifting. They go through the steps of getting further and further away from God till ultimately they defy God. And so this is what's waiting those apostates. And so this is the warning that is for the Hebrew Christians, not to return to Judaism, but to stay faithful and remain loyal to God and to Christ. And it also serves as a warning for us as well. And so
he's exhorting that group not to go back.
mhm,
Today, the preacher is exhorting us and all those who came after that second generation not to go back. To go back to what? If we're brothers and sisters in Christ, the church is actually, what is the church called? I mean, what's, okay, the called out. Okay, so we're of the world, or we're in the world, and we've decided not to be of the world. So, and there's a lot of examples of exhortation from the New Testament about not going back. And what happens if you do go back? So a lot of what the preacher is talking about in the book of Hebrews is an exhortation. You don't want to go back. Because even as these second generation Hebrews, there's nothing beyond God's grace except his judgment. You go back, you don't want to. But yet we've seen it. We have seen it within our brotherhood.
yeah. Now there are some encouragements that the preacher here has already laid out in just this chapter. Why not to go back? Well, we have the great cloud of witnesses. We have the example of Jesus. We have the love of God and we have the grace of God all there to encourage us to stay faithful. And so really chapter 12, although it is the final descent into apostasy and warning, the most stern warning probably, if you do this, you know what's waiting for you. Ultimately, the chapter is really look at God's grace. And so that's kind of how chapter 12 ends with that thought, I would say. And so the grace of God is going to be a launching point into chapter 13, which actually we have a little bit of time to kind of at least introduce some of the thoughts here. Chapter 13 is almost like reading a passage from Proverbs. There's just some really good final thoughts in this chapter about Christian living. And so there's some relationship not issues, but relationship goals that we should have with each other mentioned here to kind of help us stay on course. And so why don't we go ahead and just read the first 6 verses there in chapter 13 and at least get started. It says, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you had, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what can man do to me." And so here is kind of the summation at the end of the book. We've talked about faith. Now it's time to put that faith into practice. What does this look like in the day-to-day lives of these Hebrew Christians and for us? Doctrine requires duty, and doctrine remains sterile without duty. So we are to let brotherly love continue. We cannot be Christians without being brethren first and foremost. And so hospitality was a huge staple in the Jewish way of thinking and in their culture. And so why was hospitality so valuable in the early church? Well, persecution had scattered Christians all over the known world at the time. Traveling evangelists like Paul, Timothy, Paulus, Luke, all of those early disciples and apostles were frequently going and church planting. You never know what impact you can have on a stranger by showing them kindness either. Besides, this ends in the first century. We're not places to hang around, and some of the more rundown parts of our big cities probably don't want to hang around some of those hotels and motels. And you probably have something that comes to mind when you think about that. They were often dirty, immoral. Sometimes they were too expensive. And then there's the example of Abraham, who was hospitable to angels without recognizing that they were angels. And so hospitality for Christians is still important for us today. And so why is that? And then we'll end on these thoughts with hospitality.
The early church, in Acts, we read about the fellowship that they had.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually needed that based on what was going on around them.
Right.
The Jewish Christians were ostracized by their own countrymen because they no longer followed the law of Moses, they followed Christ. And as a result, some lost their businesses. Some, if they rented a place to live, they were probably kicked out of their homes.
Mm-hmm.
So the early church, as they met, they discovered any needs that were there and tried to help out with those needs. Plus, they were a support system for one another.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the world today, that has not changed. not at all.
A lot of them brought what they had and gave it to the church, all of it,
Yeah,
except Ananias and Sapphira.
which they could have kept whatever they wanted. That was their prerogative. But they lied
They lied.
to God, or they thought they did. We often talk about hospitality being a dying art in this country. Why do you think that is?
Fear.
Fear? Is that, did you,
Yeah.
fear? Fear of what?
It's a different world we live in. It's not safe sometimes.
Okay,
Yeah, you don't really invite strangers into your house. Families, yes. I mean, families, it's always hospitable.
mhm,
I mean, being raised with, my family being Italian-American, I mean, everything was based around the table,
mhm,
okay? Even if you walked in, the first thing they're gonna offer you is something to eat. Okay? And I would think in Mediterranean culture, that's still prevalent today. If you're a member of that family, they're gonna, when you walk into their house, it's either you give them something to eat or give them something to drink. So when you go to somebody's house and you sit down, would you like something to drink? Okay? A lot of times that's what's offered. And to be hospitable, you should accept it, whether if it's just a glass of water.
Yeah. But why do you, I mean, that's great to be hospitable to your family. What about, why do you think that it's dying in the church? Maybe I was too broad with, I mean, I think in this country it's a lost art, but I think it's a lost art in the church too. Why do you think, and I'm not talking about strangers, picking people off the side of the road, to our own brothers and sisters.
Our lives are busy.
Okay?
Yeah.
You think our lives are too good? I think we live too cushy of lives. I think we don't need each other, like probably is evidenced here. I think that could be part of it. But I think there's actually fear too. Not fear of strangers, fear of, I'm inviting my brother and sister into my house. What are they gonna find there? And so I think there's an accountability type of fear that people, they don't want other brothers and sisters too close. And so I think that form of fear is also there. Yeah.
You know, there was a gentleman who was here, most of us know him, Brother Harry Hyde, who would be Jeanette Chapman's father.
Mhm.
He noticed it when I first came here. He said, they're building all these new houses around here, and they don't have any front porches on them. And he said, because people don't wanna congregate anymore.
Mhm.
You know, people were always okay to let people come to the porch and sit outside, but when
Uh-huh.
you get inside, then you're inside.
Right.
And so he said, by not building porches anymore, people don't get together.
Mhm.
And he's right. You look at the houses they're building, you know, they don't have them. They're just flat on the front.
Yeah.
You gotta go inside to meet,
Right.
and we just don't do that.
It's a good thing to be able to identify problems like that, but it's also equally important to offer solutions.
Sure.
I think we can all agree that, yeah, there's less hospitality today than there was in years past, even in this country. What can we do
Mhm.
to try and increase that in our fellowship here?
I think that would make a great discussion for a Wednesday night review, or
I think so.
maybe next,
So the question's out there, come prepared.
come prepared.
What are we talking about Wednesday night?
Yes.
So, like I said, I don't know what David, if David just wants to do a review next week, that's fine too. I'll just get in touch with him where we are, but we should be able to finish chapter 13 fairly quickly. Again, it's almost like reading Proverbs through part of this chapter. Should be pretty easy to digest, and then we'll do a comprehensive review of some kind, and then we'll do final exam. So,
So, you know, I I've studied Hebrew several times, but I have never had to study with the qual wahomer aspect. And going through this study, you could actually see it. You could see a timeline
Oh, yeah.
of how it builds.
Yeah, yeah.
So very, very interesting.
It's definitely a literary device that was used quite a lot. Okay, so that's all I got. Bell should ring.
3, 2,